Hey guys, the Comics Kid 2099 here. I am here to talk to you today about Dragon Ball Z. If you will remember last year when I was doing the 365-day graphic novel review challenge, I reviewed a little bit of Dragon Ball. Basically the first 3 Viz-Big volumes or the first 9 of the shorter volumes of Dragon Ball. And I had several of the other Viz-Big volumes, but I didn't have the entire series. I was missing, I think, 3 of the Viz-Big volumes of Dragon Ball Z, and so I didn't want to keep going with that, and I was also not sure if I would be able to read 500 something pages a day and do a video for as far as I was going until I was missing a volume. So I went ahead and just put a stop to my reviews of Dragon Ball with Viz-Big Volume 3. And then as soon as I finished the 365-day graphic novel review challenge, the first thing that I went back to reading where I wasn't doing any videos was Dragon Ball. I went ahead and finished all of Dragon Ball, which was 5 Viz-Big volumes, and if I'm not mistaken, that is 16 of the smaller volumes. And then I read the first 2 Viz-Big volumes of Dragon Ball Z. And I was missing volumes 3, 5, and 9, and then eventually I ordered those, and just recently, last week, I went ahead and finished all of Dragon Ball Z. So that is Viz-Bigs volumes 3 through 9 of Dragon Ball Z, and that is a lot of comic. Most of the Viz-Big books are around 500 or so pages. Some of them are a little longer, some of them are a little shorter. I think the shortest one was like 475 or 480 pages, and then the longer ones are about 550 or so pages long. And so this was volumes 3 through 9, each one being about that long. If you're familiar with the chronology of the Dragon Ball Z stories, I was about halfway through the Frieza saga, and then finished that, got into the Android saga, which segues into the Cell saga, and then got into the Buu saga. And that is a lot of comic. And one thing that I realized as I was reading Dragon Ball Z, and I realized this pretty early on, but Dragon Ball Z, I'm just going to go ahead and say, I don't think that it is nearly as good or fun or enjoyable as Dragon Ball. The thing that I like most about Dragon Ball is that it's a lighthearted quest adventure series. You've got this boy who wants this special ball that his grandpa had, and that's all he really cares about. He doesn't care about material possessions. He doesn't really care about getting any of the wishes that you can get whenever you gather the Dragon Balls, and the only really time that he does care about getting a wish is when he wants to bring someone back to life, and even then, it's not for him, it's for someone else. And so I really liked the lighthearted adventure tone of Dragon Ball. You never really felt like the stakes were incredibly high. Yes, you had the Red Ribbon Army. They would go around killing people. For example, the guy who guarded Karen's tower that Goku later brings back to life. They did kill people, but you never felt like the world was at stake like you did all the time with Dragon Ball Z. And I feel like towards the very end of Dragon Ball, that's right around the time whenever you get a tonal shift in the series. And something that I mentioned in most of my videos where I was reviewing Dragon Ball last year is that in Japan, originally, it was not split up into 2 separate series. It was one very long, ongoing series. It was a weekly series in Shonen Jump that lasted about 10 years, I think. And there was no distinction between Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z. That was something that they did in America. And I think that that was a wise choice in America, splitting them up, because really, Dragon Ball Z is a very different series than Dragon Ball. Like I said, Dragon Ball is a lighthearted adventure quest series. It's, I don't want to say more child-friendly, because there are elements in that series that I would not want to expose my child to. There's a whole lot of perverted jokes, characters like the Turtle Master, he's feeling up 16-year-old girls, and that's a little icky, but then you've also got a whole lot of full frontal nudity, including 16-year-old girls, so that's stuff that, personally, I would not want to expose my child to. There may be people out there who would say, that's not a problem, my kid can look at that stuff. By the time you get to Dragon Ball Z, there's not nearly as much of that. In fact, I don't think that there's any nudity in Dragon Ball Z, but you do have a whole lot of characters screaming a whole lot, just pages and pages of a character screaming while energy is emanating off of them, and then shooting energy blasts, pages and pages of energy blasts being shot, and the entire planet is going to be blown up, and we've got this character who's stronger than anyone that we've ever faced before, and then we defeat this character, yay, and then another bad guy comes in, and he's even stronger than that bad guy that we just fought, so now our good guys suddenly have to become stronger so that they can defeat this bad guy, and you have to wonder, okay, if he was such a problem, let's say Raditz, if he was such a problem, and then they defeat him finally, and then these other guys come in, and they're like a billion times stronger than Raditz, and then our good guys, oh, suddenly, they are magically able to defeat these new bad guys, and they keep doing that. It's incredibly repetitive, and especially so if you're reading volumes 3 through 9 of the Viz-Big books all in one week. I do think that maybe if you slow down a little bit, you might enjoy it a little more than I did, and I don't want to say that I didn't enjoy this. I really liked catching up on Dragon Ball Z. I didn't read a lot of the comics whenever I was younger. Mostly, I came to this franchise through the cartoons. I remember a lot more of the Dragon Ball Z cartoon when I was younger. I started watching at the very end of the Cell Saga. I very vaguely remember seeing the characters fighting Cell, and then we get a time jump where suddenly Gohan is a teenager, and I remember bits and pieces of the Buu Saga, but I don't remember ever seeing the series conclude. So I know in the cartoon they really drew out the tournament that kind of starts the Buu Saga. They added a whole lot of stuff in the tournament that I remember from the cartoon that was not present in the comic here, but I really liked this series when I was younger, and I watched a little bit of Dragon Ball. I didn't remember as much of the cartoon Dragon Ball when I was rereading some of the Dragon Ball comics, and I had read the first, I think, 4 volumes of the smaller Dragon Ball volumes years ago, before I was rereading the series in the VizBig volumes that I have now. But I really enjoyed going through this series. It brought back a lot of nostalgia for me. I really liked getting to see some of the stuff that I had heard about but never actually experienced for myself. For example, if you ask somebody who doesn't really know a whole lot about Dragon Ball or Dragon Ball Z, name something that you think of when you hear someone talk about Dragon Ball Z, they're probably going to mention Frieza. He would be like the top 5 things that you would think of when you're thinking of Dragon Ball Z. And that's a character that I never knew anything about or had never really seen much of whenever I was watching the cartoons when I was younger or reading the first 4 volumes of Dragon Ball. He doesn't show up until the second big arc of Dragon Ball Z. And so it was interesting getting to see some of these characters for the first time through, I guess, somewhat rookie eyes for this franchise. But really, I think that starting around the last 5th of Dragon Ball, that's when King Piccolo shows up, and that's our first big, the world is going to be destroyed villain that we get. He is much, much worse than the Red Ribbon Army or Pilaf or the rabbit that can turn people into carrots. He is much worse than anybody that Goku and friends fought in Dragon Ball, and that is really the beginning of what I feel like Akira Toriyama seemed like he was much more interested in doing. And it's interesting because from what very little I know of Dr. Slump, which was the manga that he was working on before Dragon Ball, pretty much just immediately before Dragon Ball, it seems like tonally that is very similar to the first roughly 4/5 of Dragon Ball, where it's kind of children having fun, having adventures, stuff like that. The world isn't really at stake, although there is adventure stuff going on. There's bad guys to fight and stuff like that. That is all very tonally similar to the first roughly 4/5 of Dragon Ball. And then when we get King Piccolo, suddenly Goku has to go through various cheats in order to raise his power level. So he goes back up Karen's tower, and then the cat guy who is on Karen's tower, his name is Karen, he's like, hey, you can drink this magic water that will maybe make you stronger, or maybe it will kill you. And then he does that, and suddenly he gets a power boost. And we get to see a whole lot of that in Dragon Ball Z, where a character will be very nearly on the edge of death, and then once they don't die and then they recover from that, suddenly they're a bazillion times stronger, because apparently Saiyans, if they nearly die and they don't die, then they power up and they get even stronger. And then you'll introduce various MacGuffins like the Room of Time and Spirits, I think is what it's called in the manga. In the cartoon, I think it was called the Hyperbolic Chamber, and basically it's a room where time moves much, much slower in the room than it does outside of the room. So 1 year inside the room equals 1 day outside of the room, and the gravity is like 10 times stronger in there than it is outside. And so they use that a couple times in the series whenever they're preparing to battle Cell, and then later whenever some different characters are preparing to battle Buu. They use that to try and strengthen characters and make it seem like it's not a cheat, but really it is kind of a cheat. And then you'll have characters, they will do various things. They don't ever use the Dragon Balls to make themselves stronger. You'd think that would be a no-brainer. Like, if Goku needs to very quickly strengthen himself and make himself stronger so that he can defeat Vegeta and Nappa, he would just go and gather the Dragon Balls and say, hey, Shenlong, make me like 10 times stronger than what I am now. You'd think that'd be something they could do. And then they also cheat. They will kill a character off, and they'll make you think, oh man, this is a really big deal. They just killed a character off. They did that in the King Piccolo storyline in Dragon Ball, where Krillin, he gets killed off. And it's a huge deal, because Krillin was one of the major players of the series. And then they're all thinking, wait a second, we can just bring him back with the Dragon Balls. But then other characters start dying, and then they say, well, let's just bring back everybody who was killed here. And then the next time a character dies, they say, okay, but if you die, you're not going to be able to be brought back by the Dragon Balls, because you can only be brought back to life once. And then later they get around that by saying, well, there's this other planet called Planet Namek, and they have Dragon Balls there, and they're much bigger, and you can actually get 3 wishes from the dragon there that doesn't actually look like a dragon, and you can bring bring back people as many times as you want. So if Krillin died at one point and was brought back by the Earth Dragon Balls, then you can just bring him back again. There are so many different cheats in this series, and it becomes very obvious when you're reading it all in such a close amount of time. But at the end of the day, I still really enjoy the series. Whenever I was getting to the last few chapters of the last volume, I wasn't tearing up, but I was kind of getting a little bit emotional. I was getting a little bit sad seeing these characters who have come a long way. And some of the character development isn't very good. Some of it I do like quite a bit. Vegeta, he's kind of back and forth. When he's first introduced, I knew eventually he was going to be an ally to the Z Fighters, as they're sometimes called, but I was very curious how that was going to happen. And I kind of like how his character development starts around, well, it's after Vegeta and Nappa are introduced, and right around the time when Frieza and the Ginyu Force are introduced, we get to see Vegeta is like, okay, I definitely don't want to be working for Frieza anymore, but at the same time, he's not really interested in becoming an ally to Goku and friends. And then even when he does kind of become an ally, we see that he still has traces of his old self. And at times, his character development kind of backslides a little bit, but then later on, we see that he does develop quite a bit more, and that was interesting to see. But then you have some characters who, okay, all of a sudden, these two characters are in a relationship, and they're dating. We get to see that with Chi-Chi and Goku, where when they were kids, like 11 and 12 years old, Chi-Chi says, hey, Goku, when we grow up, will you marry me? And Goku doesn't really know what she's talking about, so he says, sure. And then at the very end of Dragon Ball, she comes back and she says, okay, time to get married. He says, okay. And that's their relationship. And then later on, Krillin, out of nowhere, he marries Android 18. He has a thing for her because she kissed him on the cheek. Okay, that's the extent of their relationship. The most development that we ever got in a relationship in this series was between Gohan and Videl. And even there, we got to see them interact with each other a little bit in high school. We got to see Gohan train Videl a little bit. And then once we got to the tournament, we see that he cares about her a great deal when she's getting beat up. And then we don't really get to see any more of that relationship until we do another time jump where we see that they have a daughter. And unfortunately, that is the most developed relationship that we get in this entire series. And to be fair, relationships and developing relationships and stuff like that, that was not what Akira Toriyama was trying to do. He was doing a fighting manga where 90% of the series was these characters fighting. And so he accomplished that. But I really like the way that the series ended. I love where we send Goku at the very end of this series. And I'm kind of curious about Dragon Ball Super now. That's a cartoon that's been going on for a few years now. And that's something that I know next to nothing about because the last time I watched a Dragon Ball cartoon, I was in junior high school. So it's going to be very interesting for me going from the Dragon Ball Z manga to Dragon Ball Super and seeing just what's going on there, because a lot of people seem to really like that. But I realized reading this that the series, it's not faultless. There are quite a few problems that I have with it, mostly just narrative cheats where Akira Toriyama will try to get you to care about something and try to make you think that the stakes are really high, and then just kidding, everything's all right because we're going to cheat doing this or that. But really, all in all, I think that he can be forgiven for that because he was doing a weekly 15-page comic book series for 10 years. That is a lot of comic book to do. And he was basically doing it by himself. He did have an assistant who was helping him here and there, but still, he was putting out a lot of content for a really long time. So he can be forgiven, I think, for a lot of the stuff that I complained about in this video. But anyway, that is what I read last week. So you're not getting different things that I read last week. It was all just Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z. So anyway, I hope that you guys liked this video, and if you did, be sure to check me out next week where I'll be talking about some other stuff that I read this week. So anyway, I will see you guys in the future. Have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.